I called the police on my own daughter on the night of my 45th wedding anniversary, and I have been arguing with myself ever since about whether that made me a villain or finally a grown-up. The cruiser lights washed my hydrangeas in red and blue, while a notary with a tidy bun stood at my kitchen island beside paper plates and a yellow cake. And the documents on the granite said durable power of attorney and quitclaim deed, and there were little arrows that said sign here. My daughter Paige spoke in the bright, careful voice people use when they believe certainty can be manufactured if they just keep the sentences coming, and she told the officer she was trying to protect me, and that I misplace things now, and that I fell last fall. And that the neighborhood has changed into something with cocktail bars and yoga and property taxes that grow like ivy. The officer asked me if I felt threatened, and I said only by paper and by the speed at which love can turn into management. And out by the grill my grandson Tyler kept turning the tongs in his hand like a metronome, keeping time for a song that had lost its melody. The neighbors who walk after dinner slowed down the way birds go quiet before a storm, and the notary said quick claim, and I corrected her because it is quit not quick, and the correction felt like the last thing I could still control without asking permission. The officer asked what I wanted, and I said keep your camera on because the truth behaves better when there is a witness, and then I took a breath that tasted like lemon oil and grief and began to tell how we had arrived at this scene. I am 67, a retired librarian with a spine of habits that have kept worse weather than this from blowing me over, and I am not helpless even if I sometimes need to steady myself on the banister I polish every other Sunday. My husband Frank died 8 months ago of a fast illness that entered like a draft under a door and left like a storm that has decided to stay, and I still talk to him while I water the porch ferns, and sometimes the ferns answer in a language made of shade. The house is small, honest, and stubborn, and it smells like coffee and cedar and floor wax, and it knows which step creaks on purpose in winter because the wood wants to warn you about ice, not rot. After Frank died, the mail began to include offers that arrived dressed as kindness, but felt like keys to doors I did not want to open. Glossy brochures with smiling women my age who all held mugs that said "Good Morning Sunshine" above captions about a maintenance-free life. There were letters from a developer with a logo shaped like a wedge, and from a senior community with an Italian name, and a cafeteria that smelled like boiled vegetables, and from financial firms named after uncles. And they all wanted the same thing, which was my house and the story stitched into its walls. Paige says I do not see the wind turning, that the roof is old and the bathtub is a lawsuit, that Hawthorne Court has chair Zumba and on-call nurses and someone else to shovel the icy driveway. And I say curtains matter because they are the fabric between who you are and what they see, and she says curtains are not a plan. I visited Hawthorne Court out of fairness to the future and found hallways that never change their light, rooms with windows that stare at parking lots, and a young man named Kyle who promised I could bring my own curtains like that would teach the view how to be a tree. Frank left a letter in his sock drawer dated 2 years before he died, and it says the house should be mine until I no longer want it. And then it should help the library's literacy program because he built with his hands and believed in people building themselves with words, and that mercy is not the same as wisdom when a developer comes dressed as a friend. I folded that letter and put it in my purse, and it has the weight of a brick and the tenderness of a bruise, and when I touch it I hear his pencil on wood measuring twice before cutting once. Tyler complicates everything because love is a net that catches both fish and boots, and from the dock you cannot always tell which you have until it hits your hands, and lately he has been asking for gas money, then rent money, then money that had no good name attached to it. A week before the party the bank called about a withdrawal I did not make, and my checkbook had pages missing, and I did not accuse him because I am not a detective and I do not want to be a judge. But I recognize the hungry rhythm of a boy who is beginning to owe men who do not like waiting. 2 weeks before the party, I fell on the hallway rug while carrying laundry. Nothing broken, but a thundercloud bruise on my hip and a new respect for the ways gravity votes against pride. And in that week, Paige brought soup and urgency and said we should make decisions while we can still call them decisions. I agreed to medical directives and to naming 2 people so that no one person held all the rope, and I agreed to look at plans with my lawyer present. But I did not agree to deeds signed between the salad and the cake because papers should not arrive like surprise guests carrying casseroles they expect you to keep forever. The night of the party, I set the good plates and the photographs of me and Frank at 25 and at 41, and at our last beach trip where he wore a hat that made him look like a cheerful spy. And people told stories about grill fires and snowstorms, and the year the power went out and we ate pie by flashlight. At 6:30, a sedan parked and a woman in a sensible cardigan got out with a leather bag, and Paige met her at the curb. And I watched from the window, and I knew two things at once, which were I hope she is a friend, and she is not a friend. They came inside and Paige said, "Mom, this is Linda. She is a notary, and it is a perfect time to take a few things off your shoulders." And she slid a manila envelope across the island. And the top page said durable power of attorney, and the second said quitclaim deed to an entity with a name that wore her initials like a crown. I picked up the pen because I am polite even when drowning, and I read every line, and the deed said without consideration and $0, and I laughed because without consideration might be the most honest phrase in law. I put the pen down and said no, and the room performed that particular silence that means the story will be retold for years, and Paige flushed and said I was being dramatic, and I said I had earned the right. And she said the bank is leaning on me, and then looked as if she wished she had not revealed the seam under the dress. That was when I called the police, not because I wanted anyone arrested, but because I needed the circle widened so our spinning would have to slow. And the officer arrived with the patient face of a man who has seen every version of family attempt to turn love into leverage. He asked if I was competent, and I said yes with a clarity that belonged to the librarian who lives inside me and alphabetizes the panic, and he asked if I wished to sign, and I said not tonight and not this way. And he nodded because some mothers teach their sons about consent with paper as well as with bodies. After the guests melted away like the end of a parade, Paige asked if she could sleep on the couch, and I said yes, because I do not know how to unmother her. And after she fell asleep, I took Frank's letter from my purse and read it until the lines softened into the grain of the table. In the morning, she said she was sorry and she was scared, and that Tyler had gotten into something he should not have, and that a man who does not like waiting was now waiting, and fear walked around the kitchen wearing her face. And I made coffee strong enough to lift a truck and said we would not solve anything alone. I went to my lawyer Janet, who has the temperament of a terrier and arms like a person who carries other people's worries for exercise, and she poured tea that tasted like boiled hay and then outlined a plan that turned air into structure. We drafted a medical directive naming 2 people so no one person could ever pull the lever alone, and we set up a trust with me as trustee and a neutral co-trustee who once sued a city for building a curb too high. And we wrote a rule that the house could not be sold for 5 years unless 2 independent professionals agreed it was needed for my care and not for anyone else's comfort. We drafted a firm polite note to the developer and sent it on paper that bites back when folded, and I promised myself that if I ever move it will be to a small apartment near the library with a view of anything that is not a painted stripe. Paige came to Janet's office and listened with her fingers braided together like a rope that knew how to hold, and when Janet finished, Paige signed and cried and told me thank you for giving me less power so I will have less to repent. And I held her hand the way I did when thunder used to chase her across the hall at 3 in the morning. That night, I slept like a person who had moved a boulder out of the road and woken to find it had rolled itself back a few feet further down, and in the morning the bank emailed a copy of a check with my name on it written in the way only family writes it. Dated the night of the party, $3,000, memo line reimbursement with a smiley face that felt like a small insult. I put the printout under the magnet shaped like a cardinal and waited, because sometimes waiting is how you tell the difference between paranoia and pattern, and in the afternoon Tyler arrived with donuts and panic. And when he saw the paper, he made the sound a metal chair makes when it skids across tile, and he said he took it and would put it back after he solved a problem named a man who does not like waiting. He begged me not to tell his mother, and I said silence would only be purchased with more silence later. And I offered a bargain that was not a bribe, which was I would not tell if he would let me take him to a program that helps boys before they become men who never quite apologize. And he said yes at midnight and no at dawn, and the man called Paige anyway. The officer returned with phrases like forged instrument and diversion program and record that follows, and he asked me what I wanted. And I went into the kitchen and rested my forehead against the freezer door and asked Frank to show up in the only way he can now, which is as a memory of his steady hands. I told the officer yes, I would file the report, and that my intent was treatment, not punishment, and that I would stand at every hearing and vouch if the boy did the work, and Paige's mouth made the shape of I hate you, and I love you, and I wish Dad were here. And I answered me too with a voice I did not recognize as mine. Tyler turned himself in because the boy who still knows the difference between a door and a wall has not completely left. And the judge looked like one of my former library volunteers and offered diversion if Tyler completed a program and passed tests and had someone vouch. And I stood because love is lending someone your good name when theirs is wobbling. The program was a long hallway with many doors, and on the first night, he called me at midnight to say he was leaving. And I drove over in my nightgown and sat on the hood of my car until a counselor with kind eyes brought coffee and a story about his own terrible 19th year, and Tyler stayed, which is not a guarantee, but is better than escape. Meanwhile, the trust papers got signed with ink that shook a little but dried just fine, and the developer received his no and sent back one last letter that said last and best, and we placed it in the shredder like a trophy. And the bathroom grew a bench that looks like a throne if you squint so gravity cannot bruise me as easily. I started inviting the walking neighbors in on Thursdays for tea at the kitchen table, and we named ourselves the Hydrangea Club because if you're going to be a spectacle you may as well sell tickets and cookies. And we bring the letters that smell like rescue and read them out loud, and I teach them how to see the hook hiding inside the adjective. A carpenter named Ramon fixed the porch and sometimes brought his daughter who sat on the step and read chapter books, and she would read a paragraph aloud and I would pretend not to listen so she would keep going. And when the step stopped creaking the way it creaked, he added a whisper board so Winter could still warn us about ice. Paige and I began practicing new conversations where she did not rescue me and I did not crown myself queen of the porch, and once a week we walked around the block and named houses after the people who live in them because it is harder to sell a house whose name you know. And she texted me small victories about debt like postcards from a city she was finally leaving. Some days we laughed about Hawthorne Court and the soy candle yoga, and some days we did not. And on the days we did not, I went to the library and shelved returns for an hour because order is a mercy. And then I came home and cooked enough soup for an army because cooking is how I knit holes in the afternoon. Tyler failed one test and passed the next 4 and failed another, and learned how to say I lied without performing the kind of apology that is just a longer lie. And he stopped wearing his cap inside because the counselor told him eyes are doors and people need to see them open. At the second hearing, the judge asked me if I still wanted to vouch, and I said yes, and also that my voucher comes with conditions like telling the truth even when it rusts the hinge. And afterward, Tyler sat on my porch and confessed he had thought the check was not a crime because families share, and he had forgotten that sharing without asking is just theft wearing a sweater. The developer held a block party 2 streets over with food trucks and a band that played covers from the decade when Paige was a teenager. And the Hydrangea Club went and tasted the tacos and introduced ourselves to the newest neighbors and told them our street has rules written in pencil and kindness written in pen. And I came home certain I had chosen correctly even if choosing correct did not deliver peace by return mail. One afternoon, a woman in a blazer knocked to ask if I had considered a reverse mortgage, and I invited her in for pie and then made her read aloud the fine print until she forgot her own script. And she left with an extra slice and a face that looked a little like a student sent back to rewrite. I began keeping a notebook by the phone where I write every time I think I have misplaced something important and every time I find it again, because evidence is a better friend than panic. And I taped the list to the inside of the cabinet with the mugs so anyone who worries can check it and be bored by the facts. Paige changed banks and kept one credit card in a jar of rice in her freezer after a woman at our tea told the story of how cold plastic slows hot spending, and she says the jar makes her laugh and the laughter makes her patient. And sometimes she sends me pictures of the card like a fish on ice. The officer who came that first night stopped by on patrol a month later and asked how we were, and I said we were a work in stubborn progress, and he grinned and said that is the best kind, and he admired the whisper board on the step. And I told him he could take credit for 2% of it because witnessing is a kind of hammer. The church that is now a yoga studio let us use their back room to host a letter reading for the wider neighborhood, and 30 people came with envelopes that promised joy in exchange for signatures, and we passed around magnifying glasses and stubbornness. And at the end, we traded recipes for lemon bars and for saying no without apologizing. I practice falling safely now the way dancers do, bending my knees and turning my shoulder, and I keep salt in a coffee can by the door. And I keep the developer's logo in a drawer where I can look at it when I need to remember that wolves sometimes learn to pronounce the word neighbor. Paige asked me once if I regretted calling the police, and I said I regret everything that hurts you and nothing that kept us from making a mistake that would have cost us each other. And she nodded like a person trying on a coat that fits and still feels strange. Tyler and I planted tulip bulbs that will bloom in a spring he has to keep choosing to get to, and he joked that the bulbs are like court dates buried in the ground, and I told him the difference is tulips arrive with color if you water them. Winter came soft and then hard, and the whisper board did its job, and the bench in the shower earned its keep, and the hydrangea club became the soup and letters club for a while. And on the coldest afternoon Paige and I made cookies that looked like little houses with doors you could paint with icing. When the thaw came, the developer sold the last unit at the mill and sent a postcard that said "Welcome to the neighborhood," and I thumbtacked it to the cork board above the phone like a bug in a museum and wrote on it "Already here" in a hand that looks exactly like mine. On a Sunday morning in April, we had pancakes, and Paige came with groceries, and Tyler came with a toolbox, and no one was crying, and we talked about nothing important on purpose, because important has worn holes in us. And after breakfast, Tyler kneeled by the baseboard and fixed the outlet that has wobbled since 1999, and his hands did not shake. Paige washed dishes and caught herself before she started narrating what he should do, and she set the urge down gently like a glass that might crack, and I pretended not to notice so the moment could feel like something we had always known how to do. When they left, I took Frank's letter from my purse and tucked it behind our wedding photo, because talismans do their work better when they are close to their stories. And I told the empty room that my best looked like calling the police and calling a lawyer and calling my daughter and calling my grandson and then calling myself back from the edge again and again. If you think that is cruel, you are probably younger than me and still believe every kindness feels kind. And if you think it is brave, you are probably older and know that duty often comes dressed as discomfort. And if you think it is both, then you are exactly my age. So tell me, because I am asking you honestly and not to stir the pot, would you have signed away your house to make peace for a season, or kept your name on the deed and risked being the villain in your own family until the storm passed? And how much love can you spend before the account runs dry and the book still balances?